Okay, Mark.
All right. Thank you very much. If you were with us on Saturday, you heard Dr. Erlacher talk to us about the Daniel generation, godly leadership in an ungodly context. And if you didn't have the opportunity to hear that, it will be good for you to go back and take a look at that. That is available to see along with the notes. But if you didn't, you missed out, but you're not out of sync. So tonight we pick up with a new topic, cultural and generational trends impacting ministry today. So thank you very much, Dr. Jolene.
Well, thank you so much for having me again. It's great to be with you all. And it looks like there's a lot of familiar names, so it's exciting to have many of you back. If you didn't get a chance to watch the presentation from Saturday, I will be building on that a little bit. So I encourage you to go back and listen to that if you didn't get a chance to. But tonight we're really going to delve into cultural and generational trends that are impacting ministry. And I just want to give you a heads up that tonight I'm going to give you a lot of information. And next couple of weeks, I'll be jumping in with more of what do we do about this information. So sometimes it can be a little overwhelming when you're getting a lot of content and you're like, okay, what do I do with this all? So just given the fact that we're doing this in 4 different parts, I'm going to kind of be breaking it up, and I'll be doing a lot more of what do I do with this information the next 2 weeks. Along with that, though, I would just encourage you, please feel free. I'm going to have the chat box open, and Mark and Pastor Frank can help me as well. But if you have questions or comments as I'm presenting, I don't mind at all you posting those questions while I'm chatting. Other people can respond to those questions. I'm happy to have you have a dialogue on the side. I want you engaging with what I'm talking about. I will pause a couple of times tonight and try to answer some of those questions as we're going. And I know I did get some emails with some different questions, so I'm going to try to kind of weave those in to the presentation tonight, just based on some of the things I shared on Saturday. I always like to tell people I have 3 brothers. I'm not afraid of any question. So feel free to ask me any question. If you disagree with something that I'm saying, that's fine too. I just really want to hear your thoughts, and I like to be able to respond to what's pressing on people's hearts and minds. So tonight, I'm going to really look at cultural and generational trends that are impacting ministry today. I just love the little interview that we just heard from, I think it was the Lansdale Church, and just they're really looking at how do we engage across generations. I'm going to really paint a picture of some of the things we have to take into consideration as we're doing that will help us be more effective. And here's the approach or mindset that I come at this from that might be helpful. I'm a missionary kid. So I grew up in Latin America, spent my whole life there, and I watched what it was to do cross-cultural ministry, to have to adapt some of the things that we're doing to a culture that looks different than the one that maybe we're most familiar with. And often that's what cross-cultural ministry or intergenerational ministry is requiring us to sometimes have that cross-cultural approach. And I really just kind of want to explain why that is and what that looks like. I loved what the pastors were just saying, in the interview now, how it takes a lot of time and energy to relate to different groups, which are really different cultures who communicate differently. Some people want to open an envelope out of their mailbox. Other people want it coming via Instagram. But as we think about this, what's important to understand is that sometimes the things that we focus on in intergenerational ministry are the things that are above what we call the iceberg of culture. They're the things like how we communicate, i.e., TV or a letter in the mailbox versus Instagram or YouTube maybe, or text messages. We focus on explicit behaviors, how people dress, how they talk, what they like to eat, those kinds of things. The institutions that are important to them, how they view family or do business. Okay, so we often focus on these things that are a part of culture, but they're the explicit parts of culture. And tonight I want to start out by talking about the implicit parts of generational perspectives and culture, because these are the things that really drive the explicit behaviors. And sometimes we get caught up in the explicit behaviors and we don't understand what are the values actually that are driving those behaviors. If we can understand the values, then we can share those with oh, I'm just seeing the chat. I forgot to share the files. I'll upload that here in a second. If we can understand the mindsets, the values, then we can really be more effective as we're engaging some of those explicit behaviors. So bear with me as we kind of go through this tonight. I did just post the PDF with the notes tonight. Sorry, I forgot to do that earlier. Okay, so here's what's happening. Every few hundred years in Western history, but really we see this, you know, across civilizations throughout history, we see sharp transformations where a society or civilization really rearranges itself, and what's impacted is worldview, values, structures, arts, key institutions such as churches, schools, governments, okay? And Peter Drucker, along with many other experts, I could cite multiple cultural, historical, leadership people out there who are saying we are living through one of these really significant periods of transition. So I'll just highlight Western civilization since that's our history as we are in America, what this has kind of looked like over time. And if you don't like history, just bear with me. I'll be here for 2 minutes and then I'll move on. But if we look back a couple hundred years, you know, there was this thing called the Age of Enlightenment or the Age of Reason, and then it was followed by the Industrial Revolution. Both of those had significant impacts on how society functioned. We went from an agrarian, local communities to large cities, urban centers where people working together. The Age of Enlightenment and Reason really even birthed America in many ways as a country. So as a country, we haven't had a significant cultural shift really since our birth as a nation. If you go back a couple hundred years before that, you had this major shift with the European Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation, which really propelled us out of the Middle Ages. So when you think of just the profound impact of these shifts on culture and how the world functions, you understand the extent of what's going on right now. We're going through a major cultural shift that's being informed by things like globalization and technology. And then you add something like a global pandemic onto it. It's just accelerating the rate of change that had already been occurring. So some of the things that are impacting this current cultural shift are things like deconstruction, pluralism, relativism, and I'm going to talk about what that means for us as we think about ministering to a generation that has grown up in a very different culture. Because what's happened is as culture has shifted, and really the shift began in the 60s and 70s, a lot of postmodern ideas have been around for hundreds of years, but it takes time for it to boil down into popular culture where it impacts our daily lives. And so it's really through a lot of the changes that occurred in the 60s and 70s that the ideas I'm going to talk about today came into education, into the media, into society in general, and they've informed the way that especially younger millennials and Gen Z, so really those 35 and younger, have been raised. It doesn't mean that they all think with postmodern mindsets, but they are surrounded by a culture. They've been educated in postmodern values. And we're going to look at what those values are because they help us understand what does it look like to do ministry cross-culturally. So I know there's some on the call who may have grown up, maybe younger, maybe millennials or Generation Z, who maybe grew up in an education system that was more postmodern. And so understanding the views of someone older than you can be helpful. And many older people were raised in modern mindsets. Now, I've met people who are 85 who have a postmodern mindset. I've met 15-year-olds who think with a very modern mindset. So it doesn't mean just your generation dictates your views, but it helps us understand the culture that surrounded each generation. Okay, so one major difference between the modern era, which is really how many of us who are 35 and older were raised, our education system, our parenting approaches, everything kind of informed us this way, was that facts, logic, and reason were what you should rely on when making decisions. This really came out of the age of reason and the Enlightenment, which have informed our society for the last couple hundred years. So facts, logic, and reason were important. When you think about how we preach, how we've taught in our universities and our schools, even how we do evangelism and sharing, a path to salvation, that we use a lot of reason and logic to lay that out. And we rely on reason to make decisions. What happens in a cultural shift is that you kind of push back against the way things have been, because what happens is that we start to see maybe not everything worked perfectly with this approach. And so we look for alternative approaches. And often, because humanity does this, we swing all the way to the opposite extreme, right? So in this case, what we see with postmodern mindsets is that people are being told to make decisions based on emotion, experience, and story, to be true to themselves and what they feel and what seems right to them, okay? You see in advertising and marketing, and just in society and news, just this push to appeal to people's emotion. We use images and stories rather sometimes than facts, logic, and reason. We're seeing this play out in many ways in 2020, right? So what are facts? What do we rely on? And so there's a lot of, you see this conflict occurring throughout our society between making decisions based on facts and what are facts versus emotions, experience, and story, okay? So this is a significant impact. We live in what's called a post-truth world. It's in 2016, the Oxford Dictionary Word of the Year was relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. Post means belonging to a time in which the specified concept has become unimportant or irrelevant, meaning that facts for many people have become irrelevant. So it's important to understand, as we're engaging a younger generation or an older generation, that the culture that they're a part of, regardless of how they personally engage or make decisions, the culture around them is telling them to make decisions in a certain way. Great comment here. The Closing of the American Mind, someone's quoting that book. That's a very interesting book that talks about some of these things. I would recommend that as another resource for understanding some of these dynamics. Okay, so let's look at some other things that are impacting just the shift in culture, okay? We're equipping for cross-cultural ministry here, okay? So in the past, we have really established a lot of power distance and hierarchy in our cultures. This has really been a part of culture since forever. But the Industrial Revolution really solidified what it looks like in our society today, where you had a whole bunch of people, instead of working for uncle or the neighbor or someone down the street, where there was already relational capital and you understood people, there was accountability within a local community. You had people moving to large cities, working with people they did not know, living next to people they did not know, and having to follow a boss, a supervisor who had no insight into their life. And so we established these hierarchies and power distances where you had the boss in the corner office or the supervisor up, above the factory floor, looking at everybody. And we set this space. You had the professor in the front of the classroom with the students sitting over there. You even see how power distance can play out in a church, right? Someone standing in front, talking to the people who are listening. And so this helped reinforce kind of the hierarchy that allowed society to kind of function. And authority was based on power, position, titles, experiences, education, those types of things. And that gave you a place in the hierarchy and gave you power. The thing is that today power is collapsing. There's a great book, The End of Power by Moises Naim, that talks about how globally power is easier to get, harder to maintain than ever before. Why? Because of things like social media and the internet. Everybody has information. Everyone can post their ideas. Okay, a 13-year-old can tweet as easily as the president of the United States. And so suddenly the things that might have given us a sense of power in the past. I'm a professor. I teach at 3 different universities. In 5 minutes, my students can Google the most up-to-date information on whatever topic I'm presenting on and know more about it than I learned in my doctorate. And so this gives them a sense of knowing more than the teacher, which sometimes they do. Okay. So it changes the dynamic of power. So what we're seeing today is that participation and engagement are critical to respecting and being and buying in and following authority or believing in something. People want to participate. They feel like they can. They've been commenting and sharing and posting their own opinions since they were 2. So we have to find ways as we teach respect for authority, because it's still important to model that participation and engagement that is still biblical. We see it with Jesus, right? He sat around with his disciples, allowing them to participate and engage in the ministry that he was doing. And so there are biblical models for this type of leadership where we lead out of relational equity and out of the respect that people have for us, and we allow them to engage and participate alongside us. So I think that it's just important to understand how this is changing. We've moved from a mechanical and structured world into organic and open kind of society. So you see this as large box stores are closing down, and you have these little startups or online, why you have Macy's closing and Amazon is booming, right? Amazon has the ability to adapt and respond to the needs around, because it's virtual and it's more flexible in some ways, whereas a mechanical structured approach can be really hard. We've moved from efficiency as paramount to success to adaptability being paramount to success. And so one of the things we have to think about as we're engaging the next generation is how quickly, how flexible are we? Are we able to adapt to new needs that emerge? And how are we doing that? Because this is really important to the younger generation. So in some of the ways, we've kind of moved from that top box, of a lot of structure, a lot of hierarchy. Not that that doesn't still exist or have a role, but we're finding a world that looks a lot more like the bottom image, where there's a lot more interconnectedness and networking versus structure. And we have to think about, what does that mean then for our ministries? So General Stanley McChrystal, in his book of Teams, he talks about this change, how it's affecting the military, business, governments. And he says of his time serving in Afghanistan, Iraq, that the speed and interdependence of events had produced new dynamics that threatened to overwhelm the time-honored processes that the military had built. And one of the ways we're seeing this in places like that is you have, large industrial revolution style militaries trying to fight these very organic, flexible, adaptable networks. Okay. And it can be very, very difficult, because by the time you get a piece of intelligence and it goes all the way up the chain of command and gets all the approvals, and you approve a mission to go deal with whatever that intelligence was, it might have already happened and 3 more things have happened, because the network's able to adapt and move. So we're seeing this impacting every aspect of our society. The world is just changing. And I think for us as the church, asking, okay, as we're encountering these new dynamics and this new culture, and we're looking at our time-honored processes and traditions, it goes back to what I talked about on Saturday, about really looking, what are things that God is allowing to be shaken, and what are the things that are unshakable? What are the things that cannot be compromised? They must remain. And what are the things that maybe in this season require us to do some evaluation? Okay. I'm just kind of jumping through the chat box here. Mark, if there's any questions that come up, feel free to interrupt me because I'm not going to be able to read them all as I'm going. Any questions so far on anything?
There's been a bit of a dialogue going on regarding how do we preach more emotively and what does that mean? And some folks saying they're not as comfortable with emotionally charged sermons, while others are saying it's not so much about emotionally charging your sermon as reflecting the emotions of the passage. Thoughts?
Yes. Oh, that's a great question. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, I think you're right. It doesn't have to be emotionally charged. I think that's a good point. What young people are desperate for today, they're living in a world where they can not trust anything that they read or see. And I'll talk about this a little bit later, and I'll talk about the next couple of weeks. They are desperate for authenticity. They want something that's real, because everything can be photoshopped. Everything can be fake. Everything can be fake in their minds because they're viewing so much of the world through their screens. They desperately want authenticity. And they are hungry to see people who have authentic joy, authentic peace, authentic sorrow when sorrow is needed, that their lives have been authentically changed. And so I think the comment you made, Mark, about really being able to portray that authentic emotion as we're talking about the gospel, it doesn't have to be an overly emotive way. It just needs to be real. They want to see the realness. And sometimes we've kind of, in the past, leaders or churches, we've kind of been like, we need to, have a certain demeanor, of a respectful demeanor, reverent demeanor. And in some of that, we've allowed the emotion not to come through as much. But this is a generation that desperately, desperately needs to see the authenticity of our faith. The other thing that I would share, for people who are teaching or pastors who are preaching, one of the things that can be really, really helpful is to share your own story or your own experiences. They want real experiences of people's lives being impacted, not from 10 years ago or 20 years ago, but yesterday, last week. How is God? What are stories in your life or in other people's lives around you? What are experiences that people are having that are powerful? I remember, I'll just share this quick story. My poor pastor has me at his church, right? So we have lots of these conversations. And I remember once he was saying, Jolene, what would you say? Because the 50 and older crowd was really resonating with his sermons. The younger people were not. And he's like, what would you tell me to do to help engage the younger people? I said, you give them nothing of yourself. You have this beautiful 3-point sermon with verses and all of these, biblical examples. They don't know who you are. They need to connect with you as a person. And so the next Sunday, he preached a sermon. In the middle of the sermon, he paused and he's like, he was reading, a passage, he paused a verse. He's like, this is a verse I've been reading all my life. He's like, I've been in ministry for 35 years. I have no idea what it means. And in the congregation at that moment, you could instantly hear from everybody 50 and older, right? The pastor just said he doesn't know what the Bible means. And afterwards, he's like, I literally had a line of millennials waiting to talk to me because they're like, Pastor, if you love God and he's active in your life and he's using you, and there's still things in the Bible that you're figuring out, then I have hope for me. I can be used by God, even if I'm still figuring out things. So those are the kinds of things that just allow them to connect with us in an authentic way, to be able to see we're real humans. We have real experiences, real emotions too. And, we want to engage with you in that way. So hopefully that is helpful. I think one of the challenges, someone is mentioning it here in the chat box. My parents have been pastors and missionaries for 35 years. I grew up in the generation where you sat on the front row and you behave and you do not whisper, you do not do anything, because if you misbehave, this church might not support us, because pastors and missionaries are supposed to be perfect, right? So that was my experience growing up and watching my parents have to live through that. So you're right. This is a very different generational expectation. They want pastors and leaders and mentors who are imperfect and are willing to say, God loves me in my imperfection, because that means that God can love them in their imperfection. So it is, and it is tricky when we have multiple generations that we're trying to relate to. But that's really what they're looking for. More than an emotive sermon, they're looking for that authenticity. So hopefully, yes, I love that, pastor as a person versus pastor as a professional. That's so powerful. Okay, great. Let's look at a few of these other things then that we're seeing as changes: determinacy versus indeterminacy. And I really like to highlight this one because often younger generations are accused of being of not being committed, not being dedicated, and a lot of it comes back to this piece right here. So determinacy is when you feel like you can determine what results are going to be. So when culture is stable and things are fairly normal, we know that what worked yesterday can work today and it will work tomorrow. And so we can kind of determine those results. So when you think about, different periods of history where maybe we believed in, things like if you work really hard in school, you can go to college. And if you work hard at college, you get a good grade, you get a degree, you're going to be able to get a job that's going to be able to pay your bills. You can pay your mortgage, and then you'll have this beautiful house, and you'll be able to retire with your pension and live happily ever after. So things like that were things that informed a sense of determinacy where we could determine certain things. Young people today have lived through 9/11, the recession of 2008. They've lived through, now they're living through a global pandemic and social unrest. And so they have seen people work a job for 20 or 30 years and lose that job when it was not financially solvent for the organization. They've watched people pay their mortgages and lose their houses. They've watched a whole generation of millennials graduate in 2008 and 2009 and not be able to get jobs and pay off their student loans. So they do not believe that you can determine the future. The pandemic is accelerating this dynamic where it feels like I cannot predict the future. So why should I do something because I can't predict that it's going to have the result that's being promised. So often they often are functioning in a survival mode. I'm going to do what's going to help me survive today. And I'm going to do what's going to help the people right next to me, my best friends, my family, survive today. So that means that being committed to a program or an institution or something might not be what's most important to them, because the world feels very uncertain and very unstable. This feeds into these next couple of, let me just jump down to the institutions versus individuals, because this really plays into this factor where they have completely lost faith in institutions. Young people have very, very little faith in institutions. In schools, government, even churches, any institution that says it's going to do something. They've watched institutions make promises and fail. They've watched moral failures. They've watched financial failures. They've watched embezzlement. They've watched all kinds of scandals of every sort affect every type of institution. And they just do not have faith in institution. What they have faith in more so are individuals, and those individuals who they feel like they know and can trust because they're authentic and transparent. So as we think about how we engage this next generation, this is a huge cultural piece to engaging this next generation and understanding they are not going to commit to the church, most likely, because it is an institution to them. It is a building. What they will commit to are people within the church who believe in them, who they know they can trust, who they know care about them, who they know are willing to sacrifice for them. So they are very much committed to individuals. We see this even in the workplace. Young people are not always committing to their places of work. They will commit to a supervisor, they'll commit to a colleague. They're very seldom committing to an institution. It's one of the many reasons that they are in jobs for 2 or 3 years at a time. So just something to keep in mind, because that kind of plays into the indeterminacy, right? They don't believe organizations might even be there in 5 or 10 years. So I'm going to commit to individuals. Okay, another change that we're seeing right now is the shift from a culture of creation to a culture of deconstruction. So whereas the modern era, coming out of the Age of Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, was all about building and creating and developing. I mean, we sent people to the moon, we built all these organizations and denominations, we built all of these corporations. It was an era of believing we could build and create and do things. Well, in the midst of all that, we have a generation that's come along and seen that everything did not work out perfectly all the time. So there were these unintended consequences sometimes that were not as positive as promised in all of this creation. And so as a result of that, this is a generation that's being taught to deconstruct. I can testify to this from 12 years of higher education. I mean, walking out of a college classroom, I would so often just feel completely hopeless and deflated, because what we would do in classes is sit and deconstruct why whatever we were looking at in that night or that class was imperfect, all the flaws, all the brokenness, all the weakness. And we were being taught to look for what was not working so that we could not repeat those same mistakes. But what has often happened with this generation, and this is where, as we talk about mentoring in the next couple of weeks, we'll talk about this, is they've not been taught then to construct. They've not been taught to create. They've been taught to see all the failures, all the weaknesses. They've not often been taught to see the good in the midst of the weaknesses. They've been taught to fear failure. That failure is so bad. We're going to bail out whoever's in danger of failing, right? We're going to come to your rescue. And this has been modeled for them. We're going to talk about education a little bit, even by parents and teachers, where there's schools now that have no fail policies, where we will not let kids fail. Failure's so bad. So they've been taught that failure's bad, flaws are bad, everything's bad. And we've not taught them how to actually, failure's required for creation. And you have to be able to take some risks to actually find some beauty. And so this is something that it just grieves my heart, because I see a generation that's being robbed of the joy and the beauty of creating because they've been taught to just deconstruct. Now, what this looks like is asking why. This is a generation, millennials and Gen Zers, and even some of us Gen Xers, we have to know why, because we've been taught to deconstruct. And if we do not get an answer to the why, two things is going to happen. One is we're not going to trust the people that we're asking the whys of, because we're going to think they're hiding something from us and they're not transparent and authentic. So we desperately, if we have a young person who's asking why, often we take that as disrespect, like they're questioning our authority or they're questioning something. In reality, it is a gift, because if we have a young person asking why, we have one that's engaging with us, and it is creating an opportunity to actually be able to give them some of the whys that can give them some of the pieces for actually moving forward and creating. Here's two things that happen if we don't give them the why. Today, young people can get a why. They know there's information out there and it's at their fingertips. In many cases, they're going right to their screens for answers to their questions. So if they're actually asking us a question, this is a rare gift, because they're engaging with us as a person versus going right to Google to find out the answer. But if they ask us and we don't answer the question, they're for sure going to go to Google or somewhere, someone who we may not want them going to get an answer that might not be accurate. So if young people are in our churches or in our families or in our communities and they're asking why, even if it's with like, why, which sometimes is the attitude of the younger generation, engage that with grace, because it is a gift. And here's the thing, they're going to get answers to their questions, and we want them getting those from sources that are accurate, that they can actually learn from. Here's another thing to keep in mind as churches, pastors, leaders, parents. Often we are answering the questions we want to answer as we're preaching, teaching, mentoring. We're not answering the questions they're actually asking. And so we need to be really tuned into what are the questions weighing on the next generation and make sure that we're answering those questions, even when they're not asking them verbally, they're asking them in their hearts and their minds. Okay, I spent a lot of time on there. Okay, some great comments here. Anything, Mark, that I've missed as far as a question that you would throw in before I kind of move on?
Patrilla was saying easy to assume and judge that younger folks just don't have the work ethic, and talking about just some of the differences in light of their lack of connection to institution.
Yep.
I don't know if you want to speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, no, that's a great insight. And I'm going to touch on that a little, work ethic, a little bit more in one of the next sessions, but I'll just touch on it briefly here. You're right. Their work ethic does look different. They're not committed. Two things I'll just highlight. One, they're not committed to institutions. They also don't see work as being confined to a clock, and that can get them in trouble. They often are able to accomplish a lot more in a lot less time, with a lot less energy than other generations because of their ability to work with technology. So they really feel like they should, if they're given a task, give me the time and space to do that on my terms, and then I'll get it to you. I'll give you an example. I have a millennial producer for my podcast. I have another millennial producer for my website, or designer. And so I will get things from them at 4 a.m. I will get them, 2 days late, but it will be phenomenal product. And so there is a different, they don't see it as 9 to 5, like you're paying me for the hours, you're going to pay me for my expertise and my ability. And they feel like in a virtual world, you can do that. And I mean, again, the pandemic and our Zoom world that we have right now is reinforcing this. There are a lot of millennials at home who are getting all of the work they used to do in 8 hours a day at work done in 4 or 5 hours at home. Here's the other thing I'll say. They've also watched older generations sit and make 5 hours of work last 8 hours, right? Because they were getting paid by hours. So there's a lot of differences as far as how they work. Here's what I found. The young people, millennials and Gen Zers, who believe in me as an individual, who I believe in them, and I contract with multiple millennials, they will bend over backwards to meet your needs if you're willing to believe in them. So yes, they will work very hard for individuals. I've managed millennials most of my career, being a young Gen Xer. So they're some of the most committed workers when they feel understood, heard, valued, mentored, invested in. So yeah, great.
And the only other thing, Dr. Jolene, there was quite a bit of discussion about that freedom to fail, and allowing room to experiment. And a lot of folks were talking about having that, allowing people to try and fail fast, learn from it, move forward.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the things that I see with leaders, there's a I think I was actually in the Nebraska region. I think it's I'm not sure if it's the Prairie region, whatever. When I was there, I remember a young man came up to me when I was doing a similar presentation, and he was 16 and he had an 18-year-old friend. And I'm like, they were on fire for the Lord. They showed up with a bunch of people who were, 40 and older. And I said to them, I'm like, come sit down with me on a break. Tell me why you're here, why you are invested in the church, why you're passionate about ministry. They're like, because this church lets us try things and do things and fail and participate. We told them we wanted to try, we knew how to play an instrument. They put us on the worship team. We told them we had this idea for an outreach. They let us try it. And when we fail, they didn't blame us. They didn't accuse us. They helped us learn from it. They picked up and moved it on. And they were okay with us, our ideas, empowering our ideas. So yes, I think just that letting them fail at our expense a little bit. Not that they need to feel the weight of their failure, but in many cases, we just punish young people when they try something new or they have an idea and it fails. Instead of saying, hey, I vouch for them. He and I or she and I think this is a good idea. Let's try it. And if it fails, I have their back. I'm going to help them work through it and move forward. So I think that can be really, really powerful.
Thanks.
Yes.
Awesome.
Okay. So the last thing If there is a foundational tectonic shift that has occurred in the midst of this cultural shift, it's these last ones, okay? And this is what I'm gonna hone in here for a little bit. Power and faith in human reason versus power and faith in personal experience, which we've already talked about a little bit. And then confidence and reason to discover truth versus the acceptance of self-determined pluralistic views. I cannot emphasize how critical this is and how this is impacting young people's approach to faith. So self-determined pluralistic views is the idea that every person gets to determine their truth. And pluralism means that you can have more than one. So everybody can decide their own truth, and that there can be multiple truths that we're called to hold at the same time as equal and valid. So this pluralism or relativism, where truth is relative to a person or an experience or a context, is undergirding this whole cultural shift. Whereas in the past, we used to believe there were absolute truths based on facts, logic, and reason, okay? Versus now this idea that you get to decide what's true and there can be many truths at once. Imagine being 15, 16, 14, trying to figure out your identity, your worldview in the midst of this context. It is incredibly disorienting. Here's what we're finding. Gen Z, which is really those roughly 25 and younger, is the most individualistic generation to come along ever. There are multiple reasons for this. But individualism is behind most of the fundamental cultural changes of the last few decades. Individualism encourages people to feel good about themselves. Positive self-views are one of the hallmarks of individualistic cultures, which encourage self-promotion and self-esteem. And here's the thing I want us to remember. Young people do not raise themselves. Gen Z did not come out of the womb saying, I want to be the most individualistic, self-centered generation ever. We did this to them. We allowed an education system, parenting trends, a culture, society, media, all to inform them that they get to determine truth, that they need to feel good, that they need to do what feels right to them. We have told them this message. Kids do not come up with these things on their own. They have not raised themselves. So it breaks my heart because there are so many detrimental things that come out of being focused on ourselves, right? So as we think about an individualistic culture, here's what's happened. Okay, so if we look at some really broad cultural trends, you think about the pre-modern era. Okay, so before modernism, every society, every civilization globally, when we look at their history, believed in some supernatural power. It might have been, I mean, it could have been nature, it could have been, multiple false gods. But they believed in something greater than themselves, okay? And that God or the supernatural realm furnished the basis for morality, human dignity, truth, and reason. Then with the Age of Enlightenment and reason, morality, human dignity, truth, and reason began to rest on foundations other than God in the supernatural realm. So things like reason, science, race, okay? So this was really coming out of the Age of Enlightenment and the Age of Reason, okay? Now what we're experiencing with postmodernism is this shift to the fact that every meta-narrative or story or system that's out there is suspect. We are to question it, we're to deconstruct it, we're to, doubt it, whether it's religious or not. So we're seeing this in our society. Just turn on the news for 5 minutes. Okay? You see it everywhere, that we're living in this time where there's this push towards the belief that no universal foundation for truth, morality, or human dignity exist. So really, Friedrich Nietzsche sums it up in this statement. Like I said, these ideas float around for a while before they drift into public, kind of into popular adherence. Friedrich Nietzsche said, you have your way, I have my way. As for the right way, the correct way, the only way, it does not exist. And this is really the world that our young people are living in today. This is the messaging that's been given to them. So even young people who are very firm in their faith, they're inundated with this messaging all the time. I have 7-year-old twins. When they were 2 or 3, I heard it coming through little shows that they watch. They hardly get any screen time. Bless their little hearts, because if the messaging is just everywhere. And so it creates a lot of confusion. We know the research tells us that by age 13, most kids have determined their worldview. And the messaging is inundating these young minds as they're trying to figure out what is right or wrong. They're being told there is no right or wrong. And really what it's manifesting as is this idea of tolerance. Now, the definition of tolerance has changed. In the past, we used to define tolerance as understanding and respecting someone that maybe had a different point of view than we did. Today, the way that we're defining tolerance is not just understanding and respecting, but accepting and affirming every point of view as equal or valid. Okay, so let me just say that again. It used to be understanding and respecting other points of view, even if we disagreed. Today, tolerance means accepting and affirming every point of view, even if you disagree with it, which makes it really, really hard for young people to actually embrace any belief. Because if I believe something that says someone else is wrong, I'm not being tolerant. Intolerance is the highest moral value of Generation Z. So here's how it's defined by O.S. Hawkins. He says, tolerance is the new buzzword and the law of the land. And it has a different definition than it did just a few years ago. Tolerance used to mean that we recognize other people's beliefs and value system, even if we didn't share them. But today, tolerance means that everyone's values, belief systems, and lifestyle should be accepted. So this is creating a lot of disorientation. And a lot of times young people are coming into church. I mean, I've talked to so many young people having this experience, and they're hearing, us talk about how this is right and this is wrong. And it just flies in the face of the cultural values that they're inundated with all week long. So it's creating this spiritual crisis for them to figure out, how do I determine what to believe or how to believe it? And there aren't a lot of safe spaces with trusted adults who are going to let them just sit and process this, or who are going to ask them the questions, who are not going to be offended by some of their points of view and their struggles. They desperately need people to just love them and help them process through this. This is impacting then as we think about how younger generations are engaging others in their generation. Barna reports that almost half of millennials agree, at least somewhat, that it's wrong to share one's personal beliefs with someone of a different faith in hopes that they will one day share the same faith. Though Gen Z teens were not included in this study, their thoroughly post-Christian posture will likely amplify this stance toward evangelism. So what we're finding is even young adults who say, I am going to adhere to a faith, I'm going to adhere to the Christian faith, I believe in God, I believe in scripture. It is really, really hard for them to talk to other people about faith or scripture. So let me just pause here. I see a couple questions on tolerance. Okay, so someone's asking, let me just scroll up here. Okay, I'm going to look at Williams. Okay, I see tolerance especially for religious views where often regarded as hate speech, and according to surveys, a third of college students affirm that this is correct and acceptable, use violence to stop speech that offends them. Absolutely. We are finding this even globally. One of the things we're finding with Gen Z is that because of technology and globalization, views are being transmitted globally. And I just was reading a survey globally where young people think that hate speech should be stopped. And hate speech is anything that basically says someone else is wrong, right? So it's not wrong, but does not viewed as accepting. So here's how I like it's very contradictory. So I acknowledge that. Here's how I like to define it. You are to tolerate anything unless it is intolerant. So they justify hating certain views in this mindset or being intolerant of certain views if they've been labeled or viewed as intolerant. So here's something else I'll just pause and say. We do not wrestle against flesh and blood, right? So when it comes to the Bible or Bible truths being labeled as hateful or intolerant, which is happening in certain places in our society already, we have to remember that we do not wrestle against flesh and blood. The enemy wants to silence truth. And often what happens is we are reacting to the people who are calling biblical truths intolerant or hateful, instead of sometimes fighting those through prayer and other means, love and things that will, have greater power. We need the Holy Spirit to reveal truth to people today. We cannot convince them with facts, logic, and reason. We need them to have a revelation from God of truth. And so I just have been so convicted in my own experience when I just feel like at a loss. This is not fair. It's not just. It's not right. Jesus said, blessed are you when they hate you and persecute you, for the sake of for his sake. And so if we're experiencing this, the Bible said it would happen. And we see how Jesus countered it. He countered it with love. He countered it with prayer. He countered it with living out the scripture. And I think we are in a really interesting season where God's really calling us to this humble, loving, prayerful advancing of truth and recognizing that there will be a form of persecution. And this is what young people are experiencing. I've talked to so many young college students, high school students who are like, I do not dare say I believe in God in my public school or my public college campus, because I will be made fun of, I will be persecuted, I will be ridiculed, I will not have any voice to speak, I will lose all my friends. So this is already happening, this form of social persecution for this younger generation. Great. Mark, any other questions that I missed?
One other, Alex wrote regarding some of the racial tensions we're experiencing. Does this explain the difference in racism debates in our today? Older generations respect authority, younger generations suspect all authorities and deconstruct the system, and that creates tension?
That is part of it for sure. Yes, that is part of it. That's a whole nother topic we could go into for like a half an hour. So, but yes, to your point, there is some of that definitely playing into some of the racial tension in our country right now, for sure. Yep. I think the other thing that's hard is with the tolerance is that we have various definitions for things. And it's really hard to get clear definitions on things, which also people can be having conversations and talking right past each other. And so I see some of that also contributing to some of the tension that we have right now. There's just this deconstructing of everything is not just people's experiences, but also even definitions and how we're talking about things. So yeah, great point.
Thanks.
Okay, let's go ahead and now I want to just remind you, I'm giving you a lot of information today and it's not all super hopeful and happy, okay? But the next 2 weeks, we're going to talk about what can we do. I'm going to try to give you a few takeaways today as well. But okay, so young Christians are struggling more than ever to represent what they believe in a post-Christian culture, because often the tools that they're being given are those from a modern era. We're giving them tools from a modern era on how to interact and engage in this postmodern era. So not only is it difficult, but they don't have other things to draw upon from those of us who are their mentors and their leaders. So this is very, very difficult. In a culture of trigger warnings, they're often worried of saying something that's going to be offensive, right? Or being viewed as intolerant. So often I hear young people, I love God, I want to serve God. And, my mentors, my leaders, my pastors think I'm not committed, I'm not dedicated because I'm not doing evangelism, I'm not bringing my friends to youth group, but the pressures that they are under are so different than even 15, 20 years ago. And we really have to, acknowledge that as we're engaging them. Here's what we're finding. 59% of young adults with a Christian background have dropped out of church involvement. And nearly 2/3 of all young adults who are regular church goers have dropped out at one time or another. So this is impacting churchgoers, as we've all seen, not just those who maybe are unchurched. Okay, here are some things just to be aware of. Today's society is especially and insidiously faith repellent. And I just mentioned this. This is a great book, Faith for Exiles by Barna just put it out. David Kinnaman and Mark Matlock just put it out. And it really draws upon a lot of the same things that I talk about in Daniel generation, with this generation being a generation in exile in Babylon. And what does that mean? So it's another great resource. But here are some of the things they highlight: that today's society is especially repellent towards faith. Resilient faith is tougher to grow today using the cultivation methods we relied on throughout the 20th century. I would say just tougher in general to cultivate. And going back to the pastors who were interviewed earlier, it requires more time and energy than it did in the past. It's much harder to sit and journey one-on-one or in a small group with some young people, processing their questions, listening to them, than it is to prepare a presentation, stand up in front of 50 young people and share a sermon or a lesson. So we just have to change our mindset of what it could look like. It might just be that remnant, that one or two or three that God's calling me to invest in and cultivate their faith through mentorship or a personal relationship. Only 4% of Gen Z today has a biblical worldview, as compared to 10% of boomers, 9% of Gen X, 7% of millennials. So this trajectory is not good. I talked about that last Saturday as well. There's a countercultural, however, this is the remnant, right? This is so exciting. So there's a countercultural 10% of young Christians whose faith is vibrant and robust. And here's what we're finding. With those who buy in, with those who decide, I'm going to follow God, I'm going to be committed, they are having to break with culture, break with their friends, experience forms of social persecution, and really wrestle with what their identity looks like, even if people label them as hateful or intolerant. And so when they make that decision, they are all out committed. Now, they might not be perfect. They're going to make mistakes. They might not always have their theology right, but they are committed. And you're going to be hard pressed to turn them, away from following the Lord. And so it's so exciting because there is this remnant that God is raising up. We know right now what the research shows is it's around 4 million 18 to 29-year-olds in the US who follow Jesus and are what's called resiliently faithful, what Faith for X-Files talks about, that they are active in their faith. They're actively sharing their faith. They are developing their faith. They're engaged in their churches, whatnot. So when you think about that, it is a remnant. It is a remnant, but God can use a remnant. And I think one of our responsibilities right now as leaders in the church is to make sure that we are protecting, investing in, guarding, blessing, supporting that remnant as much as we can as we look to bring others in, right? And draw others into that resilient remnant. Okay. Here's, I'm just going to we're going to pause for some Q&A and a little bit of breakout discussion, but I just love this perspective that this is a generation that's mainly post-Christian, and apart from the grace of God, they will certainly need some outside assistance from committed parents, concerned church workers to come to faith in Christ. Their generational standing as emerging adults also makes them a strategic target for ministry endeavors. However, as they say at the beginning, perhaps our leaders and youth workers today need to think more like missionaries than ever before. And I think this is for all of us. Even as a parent, I have to recognize my kids are growing up in a culture very different than mine. And even as I'm discipling them and mentoring them or other young people around me, how do I engage them like a missionary, understanding the mindset that they're coming from as I'm looking to engage them? Great. I just see Randy's point here. Human nature doesn't change. It's so true. So there are things that we can connect with them on that are still the same, even if the culture is different, right? Great point. Okay. Any other questions, Mark, that I missed along the way? Or if anybody wants to post right now, if you have a question, go ahead and post it in the chat box. I'll pay attention. But anything that I missed, Mark, as I was talking?
I think you covered a lot of this, Dr. Jolene. I think you did a great job. Looks like
okay.
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So what I would like to do just for a few minutes here is just have us just think about our own context. Everybody's context is a little bit different. And so just think about where you see, out of all the trends that I talked about, what do you see as the most significant, maybe impacting your cultural context, your ministry, your church, your specific community? And then how should we respond? How do we respond to that? So what I'm going to do is go ahead and give us about 5 to 8 minutes. I'm going to break you into small groups here and let you just talk in groups of 4 or 5, just about this a little bit. What cultures which of these cultural shifts or changes do you see in your church or ministry? And how are you responding, or do you think that maybe God's calling us to respond? Okay, so I'll break you into groups. We'll do about about 6 or 7 minutes for you just to chat, and then we'll come back. Okay, so enjoy your conversation. Really enjoyed the group that I was in, hearing some of the thoughts that are coming out. So if you want to, as you're coming back in, you can mute and turn off your video if you want, just because then that allows bandwidth to work a little bit better. I prefer seeing your faces, but the internet does not always. Okay, I'm going to just wrap up here. I'm going to skip through. If you got the slides, if you pull the notes that I posted off the chat box, I'm going to skip some of my slides tonight because I want to give some more time to do Q&A here. So we'll cover those next Thursday. The next 2 Thursdays, I'll move some of those into the next 2 weeks. So you can just hold on to them. I want to just wrap up with a few thoughts and answer some questions that did come up from last week. So here are the generations. I should have maybe put this up at the beginning. Here are the generations that we're looking at today that are in our churches that we're ministering to. And you'll see that I have the bottom 3 generations, the youngest generations, kind of highlighted. And this is because these are generations that really represent this new cultural norm. They, even if they don't think in a postmodern way, they are surrounded by a peer culture that does. So I sometimes like to call them postmodern natives because that's the culture that they're in. There's 3 things that impact generations being unique from one another. We see life cycle effects, which is really just younger people tend to think one way, older people another way. So things like idealism, we become more realistic as we get older. Period effects are how major events impact us based on the period of life we are in. So things like the recession, how it impacted millennials graduating from college was different than boomers who were preparing for retirement. And right now, the pandemic is having an incredible period effect, especially as we think about a young generation that's still developing, and they're doing it with shelter in place and, social distancing and mask and all these things, and just the uncertainty in the world. It's going to be a significant period effect. And then cohort effects are trends that influence the next generation as they're developing their worldview, really that elementary through high school period of life. And so I'm not going to touch on these tonight for the sake of time, but we'll touch on a few more of the cohort effects, education, parenting, technology in the next couple of weeks as we look at mentoring across generations. Okay, so I'd like to just give you this. So here's what we're realizing is, for the first time in American history, we're raising a post-Christian generation. James Emery White, I cited his book, Meet Generation Z, last week. It's a great book, just thinking about how do we communicate the gospel to a generation that is growing up in a post-Christian context. So I highly encourage you to get his book. It has some great resources. I'm going to skip through these because I'm going to move these to next week. I want to just end on a positive note, because we're looking at a generation that has a lot to give. They have a lot of skills. They're self-learners. We'll talk about that more with technology. They're used to starting things, doing things, finding information. They're curious and well-informed because they have this access to information. They're extremely collaborative, but one of the things I love about especially Gen Z, they're going to make their own decisions. And they're like Gen X in this regard, so this is why I resonate with them. They're going to make their own decisions. So once God gets a hold of their heart, it's going to be hard. You're going to be hard pressed to change them. They are more cautious and realistic because they've grown up post-recession and now going through the pandemic. So they are more pragmatic, more practical than millennials. Millennials tended to be very idealistic. They're the most diverse generation in our history. They're very future focused and they work for success. They want to be successful. So we'll talk more in the next couple of weeks about what it looks like to encourage these positive traits in them as we engage them in ministry. I want to end, I'm going to really delve into these the next couple of weeks, but I want to wrap up with a few thoughts on just takeaways for how to engage the next generation. And you're going to hear me say these over and over and over again. Cultivate a relationship and earn the right to be heard. We do this by asking open-ended questions, inviting the whys, not being defensive, not being threatened, knowing that we know the truth. God has moved in our lives. Pastor Frank was saying this in our small group breakout. Just, we know God has done a work in our lives, and to just lovingly invite the real wrestling and questions that younger generations are having. Being authentic and transparent, communicating our belief in them, that God has a purpose for them, being sensitive to what God is already doing in their lives. This is something the Lord is always challenging me on. I often have my agenda for the young people in my life or my goals or my idea of what success should look like for them. And just God's challenged me, tune into what I'm doing, and then teach like a mentor, which again, we're going to have more on all these things these next couple of Thursdays. I just want to touch, these were some questions that were forwarded to me from last Saturday. So I just wanted to kind of touch on them. Just someone reflecting on some of the changes that they've seen that are unsettling to them. I think hopefully we've answered a little bit of this in the discussion tonight, but no formal church membership. It's an institution. So they are not signing up for membership in a church. It does not speak to their level of commitment or dedication, though. They are going to commit to a group, a community, to people, not to the institution. And to them, institution or membership is committing to an institution. Relationship is committing to the community. And I think, in some ways, it's a beautiful, it's different. It can be challenging for us, but it's a beautiful piece of who they are. They are so committed to people around them when those people are part of their community. And so we just have to kind of change. Their form of membership is relationship. So it's just a different way of looking at it. Just the not passing of the offering plate during worship services. Offering is a part of worship. I think now we live in a COVID world where we're not even in church. Most young people don't have checks. They don't have cash. And many, what we're finding is that actually millennials and Gen Z, the research is just coming out, is that evangelical millennials actually give significantly more. I want to say it's like 20% more than the average millennial towards things they believe in. So this is a generation that's very generous. They just, and they do give to the church. They do give as a form of worship when they're taught to do so. Sometimes we're not teaching them that, but when they're taught to do so, but it's usually going to be via text message or PayPal or Zelle or Venmo or something like that. So the offering plate to them they don't even have cash or check with them. They wouldn't even give in an offering plate necessarily. Okay, let's just talk really quickly. We have music. Okay, I'm like, ooh, this is a big one to tackle in 2 minutes here, but here's something I'll just say that I've been convicted in my own heart about music. Contemporary music is very, very different, right, than what we've maybe seen in the church 20 years ago or 30 years ago or even 10 years ago. So I grew up in the villages of Latin America. I did my student teaching in East Africa. And in both of those cases, I was in communities where there's no electricity, no running water. I spent years and years of my life in these places, worshiping the Lord to a banjo, singing the same 4 choruses over and over and over again, every single church service. It was not comfortable. It was not what I preferred. It was not, as a teenager, super exciting to me, but it was meaningful in that cultural context. And as we think about a younger generation who's coming out of a very different cultural context, music is going to mean different things to them. Different lyrics are going to mean different things to them. One of the things I often hear is all of their songs, all their worship songs are about themselves. It's about me. God loves me. God helps me. God, I'm special to God. And even I was feeling frustrated doing this research by some of those things one day. And God's like, they are declaring truth over their own lives in an age and a period of history where their identity is completely being deconstructed. They're declaring to the enemy, I am loved by God. I am special to God. I am meaningful to God. And so, some of the songs that are special or meaningful to this generation are not going to be meaningful to us. We come from a different culture, just like playing En esta reunión, Cristo está over and over up to a banjo was not super meaningful to me as a 12-year-old. I I have to worship God wherever I am with whatever brothers and sisters he's placed around me in whatever way is meaningful to them. So yes, sometimes missionary work is uncomfortable. It just is. But we are looking at a potential Judges 2:10 generation on our watch, a generation that does not know Lord. And I just feel like God is calling us to this place. Now, how do we discern when to change, what is godly or not? And I think that really comes into the word, knowing the word, prayer, discernment, in discernment as a community. What is God saying and doing and calling us to at this time? So just a few thoughts in regards to those questions. Feel free to email other questions if you have them, that if they come to you. If you're a processor who is thinking about these things in the next few days and you have questions, feel free. My email's on the notes. You can email them to me or to Pastor Frank or Mark, and they can forward them to me. I'm happy to respond to questions that you have. So, okay, I'm going to go ahead and pass this back over to Frank. I think you're still the host, right? You're good?
I think so. I think we're good.
Pastor Frank? Okay, awesome. Okay, I'm going to pass it back over. Thank you so much.
All right, friends. Good to be back, and what a great session. Thanks, Jolene, for your great insights. A lot to think about. Holy cow. Just as a reminder, as we conclude tonight, our next session will be a week from tonight, 7 to 9 p.m., October 15th. And as Jolene said, we'll be getting into the topic of mentoring across generations. So that'll be next Thursday night. And there'll be a Zoom link that'll come your way, as well as another URL that will have a link to the files that Jolene has provided, as well as link to the video that we're doing of tonight's session. So you'll be able to see that as well. And as a reminder for that we mentioned about on Saturday, there's also this evening, after we're all done here, an after session gathering. If you choose to come, we'd welcome your attendance and participation in that. There was a new link that came to you in your email while we've been on this particular session. It's one of those, if you want to come, we'd love to have you. It's a chance for us to gather together and just to have some more informal conversation about a couple of matters, as well as perhaps even talking a little bit about what we've learned and discussed this evening. So as we conclude tonight, pop into your email account and find that link and enter it in. And Jeff Johnson is already there waiting for us. I think he's putting the drinks out around the tables and putting the pretzels out. I think that's what he's doing. But let me close this in a word of prayer tonight. Gracious God, we give you thanks so much for this time together, even across these miles and literally across time zones for some that are with us. Lord, and thank you for our sister Jolene and for the insights which she brings and the gentle spirit with which she offers them. Lord, it was a hard night to hear some of the challenges that are before us, but God, you were able to do, your word tells us, exceeding abundantly beyond all we could ever ask, think, hope, or imagine. There is hope in the name of the Lord. And so, God, we rest in you. We rest in that tonight, and pray your blessing upon us as we part, that the name of Jesus would be praised by the lives that we live. For it is in his name that we pray. And all God's people say, amen. All right, friends, God bless you tonight. And we'll see you on the flip side, those of you that are coming to the after session. God bless.